Okay, take a look at the money in your wallet. It feels real, right? But it's really just a piece of paper. So what's backing it up? Well, it's a promise. Today, we're going to dig into the story of how that promise was first made, how it was eventually broken, and how that whole journey created the financial world we live in right now.
So, let's just jump right in. We use this stuff every single day, but have you ever stopped to really think about it? I mean, at its core, this is just a piece of paper. So what gives it any value at all? Well, the answer isn't simple. It's actually a pretty wild story. A story of a revolution that, and I'm not exaggerating here, completely changed the world.
All right, so to really get this, we've got to go way back. And our story doesn't start with some big government or fancy bank. Nope, it starts with a bunch of regular merchants back in 7th century China, and they were dealing with a very, very heavy problem.
I mean, can you even imagine the hassle? To make any kind of big purchase, you had to literally haul around these huge, clunky strings of copper coins. It wasn't just a pain, it was downright impractical and even dangerous. It's pretty clear they desperately needed a better way to do business.
So what they came up with was, for its time, a completely radical idea. They called it flying money. Basically, a merchant could drop off their heavy coins with a trusted agent and get a paper receipt in return. And this was the birth of what we now call representative money. Think of it like a claim check, you know? The piece of paper itself wasn't valuable, but it was a promise, a guarantee that you could exchange it for the real stuff, the actual coins that were sitting safe in a vault somewhere.
Okay, now this is what I find fascinating. Look at how long it took for this amazing idea to catch on around the world. We're talking almost 1,000 years between those first clever receipts in China and the first official banknotes popping up in Europe. And get this, when Sweden finally did it in 1661, it was for the exact same reason. They were tired of lugging around these massive, ridiculously heavy copper plate coins.
So this idea, this concept of money being a promise, it just kept growing. And it all came to a head in the late 19th century when it formed the backbone of the first truly global monetary system the world had ever seen.
So, here's the deal with the gold standard. For a good stretch of time, all the major countries basically made a deal. They agreed to tie their currency's value to a specific amount of gold. For the first time, you had this common anchor for everyone. And what that did was create this incredibly stable system with fixed exchange rates, which, as you can imagine, was a huge deal for international trade.
And this chart really shows you exactly how it worked in practice. A US dollar could get you a certain amount of gold, a British pound could get you a certain amount of gold. Since both were tied to the same thing, you always knew precisely how many dollars a pound was worth. No guesswork, it made doing business across borders so much simpler.
You know, the really clever thing about the gold standard was that it was designed to be self-correcting. It had these rules of the game. So say a country started importing way more than it was exporting. Well, to pay for all that stuff, actual gold would have to flow out of the country. With less gold at home, the money supply would shrink, prices would drop, and suddenly that country's products would be super cheap for everyone else to buy. And boom, the trade balance would start to fix itself. It sounds elegant, right? But that self-correction could be absolutely brutal. It often meant painful economic downturns and high unemployment. So its biggest strength, its rigid discipline, was also its biggest weakness. But yeah, that rigid discipline, it came at a huge cost. And as the world careened into the chaos of the 20th century, that beautiful, predictable, clockwork system, well, it was about to smash head-on into the realities of global war and economic collapse. I mean, just look at this timeline of crises. It's just one body blow after another. First, World War I hits. Countries had to pay for the war, so what did they do? They suspended the gold standard so they could print more money. Then, after the war, they tried to put it all back together, but bam! The Great Depression hits. And any hope of restarting the old system just goes up in smoke. The world was changing, fast, and the gold standard just couldn't hang on. So, after the devastation of World War II, the world's leaders got together and said, okay, let's try this one more time. But this new system, called the Bretton Woods system, had a major twist. Instead of every country linking its currency directly to gold, pretty much everyone agreed to link their currency to the US dollar. And the US, in turn, promised that the dollar would be convertible to gold. In an instant, the US dollar became the center of the financial universe. It was king. But there was a fatal flaw baked right into the system. As the world rebuilt and the global economy boomed, everyone needed more and more US dollars to trade. The problem was, the number of dollars out there in the world eventually grew to be way, way bigger than the amount of gold the US had locked away in Fort Knox. It was like writing checks you couldn't cash. The promise started to look pretty shaky. And this is the moment it all came crashing down.
Other countries, especially France, started getting nervous. They started showing up and saying, "Okay, we'd like to trade our dollars for that gold you promised us." The U.S. gold reserves were draining away. So, on August 15, 1971, President Nixon went on TV and made a shocking announcement. He was temporarily closing the gold window. Well, you know how temporary things can be. It became permanent. And in that single moment, the entire era of money being backed by a physical commodity was over. Just like that.
So what happened next? You might expect total chaos, right? But that's not what happened. Instead, the collapse of that old system just pushed the entire world into something completely new, something totally untested, the very system that we're all using right now.
And that brings us to today, to what we call fiat money. The name actually comes from the Latin word fiat, which means let it be done, or by decree. And that's really the perfect name for it. Because this money has value for one simple reason, because the government says it does. It's a decree. It's not backed by gold or silver, just a government order, and crucially, our collective agreement to accept it as payment.
So you can see just how massive this shift was. We went from a world of fixed promises, where money was anchored to physical gold, to the modern system, where there is no anchor. Currencies now float freely. Their value goes up and down against each other every single second, pushed around by the giant chaotic currents of global supply and demand.
So when you really get down to it, that money in your pocket is no longer a claim check for a piece of gold sitting in a vault. Not at all. Its value now depends on something you can't even touch. It's just a shared belief. It's all about our collective faith and confidence in the government and the economy that issued it. And that brings us full circle, right back to that first question we asked. What gives that piece of paper its value? The answer is us, our collective agreement, our trust. It's basically a social contract we've all signed. And that leaves us with one last, pretty big thought to chew on. If our entire modern financial world is built on this foundation of trust, what happens if that trust ever starts to crack?